Time for another Order faction, this time the spiritual successors to one of my old fantasy armies, the High Elves, and they are in their new Age of Sigmar form, which is the Lumineth Realmlords, and they do have some of the most stunning and gorgeous models in the range, and it also looks like they're going to have some very cool and very fun rules to go along with them as we go into 4th edition. All they really need, in my opinion, is a new updated version of Tyrion, and I would just be completely sold. Like a lot of the other factions in 4.0, they've lost a few bits of their unique battle trait abilities, but instead have gained some new tricks that I think are really quite cool, and they do also still hope to give them that feel of the old great nations that they could pick in their 3rd edition book, although in a slightly different way. One of the main parts of their traits is lightning reactions, which does return as an incredibly strong ability to let you pick 2 units to fight with one after the other in combat. So rather than switching between you, your opponent, and then back to you, you can fight with 2 units, either 2 individual infantry units or a hero and a unit near them, or even 2 units across the other end of the board. There's no range kind of limitation on this. It is just you get to pick 2 units to activate before the enemy gets a chance. So this gives you a massive advantage in not only getting as much damage into the enemy as possible before they can swing, but on top of that offensive bonus, it's also a really great defensive tool because it means you get the most out of your units before they start losing models. What I would say is the main part of the traits though is the new Facet of War abilities, and these are usually done at the start of the battle round, but one of them is done in the shooting phase, and essentially they are a choice of 5 abilities which can give certain units a buff for that battle round. So we have Shining Company, which gives your Vanari units -1 to be hit for the battle round. Power of Hysh gives your Vanari units critical hits on a 5+ for the battle round. Deep Thinkers gives your Scinari units +1 to casting rolls. Enduring as a Rock gives your Alarith units -1 rend to enemy attacks going into them, whilst the one done in your shooting phase is Move Like the Wind, and this lets you pick 3 Hurakan units that aren't in combat, and they can all move in that shooting phase, but they then can't shoot. Now, as I said, these are all once per battle round. If you've done one, you can't do another one, so you do have to choose one, but they are very powerful, and if you have an army which is focused on a particular style of units, such as a load of Vanari or a load of Alarith units, it can be a very strong and very easy way to get this almost army-wide buff across all of them for a battle round, and certainly I think ones like Shining Company or Power of Hysh will be extremely popular ones, because most armies, no matter what you kind of build for, are going to have at least a few Vanari units in them to take advantage of it. So it's a very strong, very flexible battle trait that you really can play around with when you're in the list building stage to get the most out of it. The formations for the Lumineth are very simple, and they tie in to the Facet of War traits. They essentially give you a choice to use a particular facet in addition to any other during the game. So for instance, the Vanari Battle Host, that lets you use the Power of Hysh for those crits on a 5+ in addition to any other Facet of War. So you can buff up your Vanari and say your Alarith units by getting both the Power of Hysh and Enduring as a Rock on your units. Now obviously this doesn't give the buff to both units, but it means if you've got Vanari and Alarith units in your army, they will both be getting a buff rather than just having one of them get it. The Scinari Council lets you do the same with Deep Thinkers, whilst the Alarith Temple gives you Enduring as a Rock as a free extra, and then of course the Hurakan Temple gets you Move Like the Wind in addition to another facet. Now I think this is a really good set of formations because it really does let you, as I said, get some solid army-wide buffs, even if you've gone for a more generic combined arms style of list. But where I think this gets really bonkers good is if you have gone Vanari heavy, because then you can have Power of Hysh and Shining Company on all your Vanari units, which, as I said earlier, gets you 5+ crits and -1 to be hit. So it gets all of your Vanari units a very good defensive and a very good offensive buff. The heroic traits come in the form of the Lords of Brilliance rule. You get 3 as usual, and the first is a Masterful Tactician. This is a reaction when you've used the redeploy command on a unit wholly within 12 inches of the bearer, and you count rolls of 1 to 3 on that redeploy as a 4 instead. So it's much more easy to make an enemy charge harder or make it impossible, or you can much more reliably get back onto an objective if you're out of place. In general, it is just a great way to add some reliability to that redeploy command. Perfect Strike is once per battle, but gives you the ability to, instead of fighting normally, do an automatic D3 plus 3 mortal damage to an enemy target. So no rolls to hit, no rolls to wound, just a flat 4 to 6 mortal damage. So this can easily kill a troublesome enemy hero or the last few models in a unit if you need it to. So it's incredibly strong, I think. And when you time it right, it could arguably be game winning. Finally, the Paragon of Hysh is another once per battle. It's a reaction when you declare a charge or a spell ability on the bearer, and you can re-roll that charge or that casting roll. So it is a bit niche being once per battle, but if you absolutely need to get that charge off or get that spell off, it can be just what you want to get that important buff up. So I would say it's maybe the least impressive of the 3, but still, essentially what is a free reroll for your hero is definitely not an unwelcome trait to have. In terms of your artifacts, we start with the Phoenix Stone, which is a brilliant passive which lets you roll a dice when the bearer is destroyed, and on a 3+, they're not destroyed, and you heal 1 to them. So essentially, it's a way for your hero to stick around a little bit longer. It's obviously only once per battle, and it would maybe be a bit nicer if it was on a 2+ or gave you D3 health back, for instance, but it's still a really good way to keep your important hero or general that little bit more durable in a game. The Silver Wand gives you either +1 to a wizard's power level so they can cast an extra spell, or it just makes a hero that isn't a wizard a 1-cast one. So an extra spell, again, it's not super flashy, but it is very good. Some heroes do pay a lot for being able to cast spells, so essentially getting it for free on what could be a slightly tankier, fightier hero can be a great way to keep that spellcasting going in your army, which for an army like the Lumineth is really important. Finally, the Waystone, which is once per battle in your movement phase. The unit is able to be removed from the battlefield and set up again 9 inches from enemies. So essentially it is a table-wide move to get you either out of danger or onto an objective, or just to help support a flank when you need to. It is, again, not super flashy, but really useful and will be very helpful to frustrate your opponent or deny them a charge or get you onto an objective you need. It is really handy to have. So just in general, 3 very solid artifacts, and I genuinely could see all of them being taken and used to quite good effect in this army. We do also get a spell and a manifestation lore, and like other armies, we will cover the manifestations towards the end of the video. But on the spell front, you get Speed of Hysh, which is cast on a nice value of 5+, and it lets you give 4 inches to a Realm Lord unit's movement that is wholly within 18 inches, so making your already speedy army even speedier and making even a lot of your infantry have a 10-inch move. But on things like your Dawn Riders, it will be huge, making them so much more easily able to get into combat and get a charge off with essentially that extra 4-inch of threat range. Overwhelming Heat is cast on a trickier 7+, and this lets you pick an enemy unit within 18 inches and you halve their movement until the next turn. But then on top of that, you also roll a dice, and if the roll beats the target unit's save, they also take D3 mortal damage. Now, halving movement is already a fantastic debuff, I think, but having some chip damage on top is just a really nice cherry to have, so it is all round a very powerful, very useful spell to bring that will really inhibit your opponent's ability to get charges off or get onto objectives or just get around the battlefield, which, as everyone says, movement is sort of the way you win games, so it is a really important debuff to bring. The final spell is Protection of Hysh, which has a much trickier 8+ to cast, but it is very much worth it. It's got a solid 12-inch range, and it's an aura where every friendly unit wholly within that 12-inch gets a 5-up ward. So basically giving you a pretty significant coverage where you can make your units much more durable to enemy attacks. And if you combine it with things like the Shining Light Facet of War, your Vanari units especially are going to be incredibly difficult to put down. Onto the units now, and we do have the big man himself, Teclis, and his buddy Celennar, the Spirit of Hysh. They have had a fairly substantial price drop, going from a 720 all the way down to 590, so a drop of over 100 points. He does now only have a 5-up save rather than a 4-up, which he had in third, but with 16 wounds and his 5-up ward still, he's not exactly squishy. In melee, he still has his sword for some deceptively okay attacks actually. He's got 2 that hit and wound on 3s with 2 rend and d3 damage, and then 5 attacks from Celennar that again hit and wound on 3s with 2 rend and 2 damage. So I wouldn't say he's super killy, but he can fight off smaller enemy units pretty damn well. He also has a 12-inch ranged attack with his Lunar Staff. It is only 1 attack, but 2s and 2s with 2 rend and d6 damage isn't bad. It's a good profile, it's just very swingy because it's only 1 attack and d6 damage. And then in terms of his rules, he's got a few passives. Aura of Celennar gives +1 to casting for other Lumineth wizards wholly within 12 inches of him, which just makes them much more reliable and can actually get them to +2 to cast with the Deep Thinker's Facet of War. He also has the Archmage rule, which lets him, instead of casting, so instead of rolling, just use a flat 10 as the casting value for his spells. Now he is a 4-cast wizard, just to clarify that, so he can cast 4 spells, and all of them can be done at that flat value of 10, which can't be modified. He can also do a similar thing for Unbinds, where he can use a flat value of 8, so if your enemy rolled a 7 on their cast value, you could just use that flat 8 and unbind it, but if they rolled an 8+, you would then need to roll his Unbind to try and beat it. But it does overall just add a lot of reliability to his casting, because Unbinds notwithstanding, you know for sure, you can absolutely guarantee you will get 4 spells off. With Teclis, yes, they might get unbound by the enemy, but you know you will actually be able to cast and successfully cast 4 spells before Unbinds. He does have the Spirit of the Moon ability, which is his Rampage. Once per turn, he can pick an enemy unit in combat with him and roll a dice, and on a 3+, they can't use commands. So there's no damage component in this Rampage, but turning off commands is still very good, and it can make it much harder for your opponent to actually do any damage into Teclis without things like all-out attack. And then finally we get to his own War Scroll spell, which is Storm of Searing White Light. This is cast on a 10, so he can always get it off thanks to his flat 10 casting value if you don't want to roll, and then you pick any number of enemy units that are within 18 inches of Teclis, and you roll a d3 for each of them, and on each 2+, they take that much mortal damage. So with that 18-inch aura, you can easily catch a good portion of the enemy army, and hitting all of their units or a lot of their units for 2 to 3 mortal damage could just be incredible. You could very easily end up doing, 10 or 12 mortal damage against an enemy army in a good 2k sized game. So it's very strong, and I love the fact that it will reliably go off, because the only thing stopping it is enemy unbinds, and with the value of 10 they need to beat, it's only an 11 or a 12 that they can roll to beat it, so it is very hard for them to stop it, and it can make Teclis a very scary proposition. The next hero for the Lumineth is the reforged version of one of my favourite characters from the High Elves range, which is Eltharion, and the Light of Eltharion is his new stunning model. I really do love it, but he has had a few big changes. He's gone up in points and also caught a few nerfs. He is, however, still very good in my opinion. He's now only 6 health instead of 8, but he does still have his 3-up save and now also has a 5-up ward, which does add to his tankiness. He has lost a lot of his War Scroll rules, but he does still have his fantastic melee output. He's got 4 attacks with his Fang Sword that hit on 2s, wound on 3s with 3 rend and 3 damage, and the crit 2 hits rule. And then his Scinari Blade is 2 extra attacks that hit on 2s, wound on 3s with 1 rend and 3 damage, and they are also anti-hero and anti-monster +1 rend. so he can by himself quite reliably kill an entire 10-man, 1 health, 4 up save unit, which is really quite impressive to be honest. He still has his spirit armor, which lets you ignore save roll modifiers, so he will always get his 3 up, but he can't benefit from things like all out defense. And then it also doesn't halve damage anymore, so he is quite a bit squishier from that loss on top of the 2 less health. He also still has the passive of Supreme Swordmaster, which again lets him ignore modifiers, this time to his hit and wound rolls, and also any negative modifiers to the characteristics of his melee weapons. So anything that would make him -1 to hit or -1 to wound or drop attacks or anything won't work on him. So he will always get his 3 up save, and he will always have those 6 attacks that hit on 2s and wound on 3s. So he is still really reliable. And I would say, despite going up for 250 points, he's still very, very good. Lyria Uthral is next. He is a Vanari keyword hero and also a 1-cast wizard. He has a solid 14-inch move and 7 health, so he's dropped a tiny bit of movement but gained a wound. He does come in at a whopping 90-point increase though. He is now 240 points. His combination of attacks are still fairly impressive though. He's got 2 from his Demonbane Lance and then 4 from his sword that both hit on 2s and wound on 3s with 1 rend and 2 damage. The Lance gets +1 damage on the charge and is +1 rend against demons, whilst the sword has the crit mortal rule, and then his Mount Fariel has 4 companion attacks that only hit on 5s and wound on 3s for 1 damage, so they're not much, but his main attacks profile is fairly solid. His Lance can also shoot 12 inches for D3 damage that are 2s and 2s with 2 rend or 3 rend into demons. He also still has the Voice of Tyrion, which is used when he declares all-out attack on a friendly Vanari unit, and if they are wholly within 12 inches of Lyria, then it gets the command for free. So it's a nice way to stay on top of your command points over the course of the game. And then he also has a new rule, which is a spell called Solar Flare. This is cast on a 7, and it lets you pick an enemy unit or manifestation within 18 inches, and it's the standard anti-horde roll a dice for each model in the enemy unit, and on a 5+ they take a mortal damage. But if the target is a manifestation, it just takes 3d6 mortal damage. So he's quite a reliable way to kill off those annoying enemy manifestations as well. I would say overall he's very pricey and bordering on too pricey, but he does bring a lot. He can get you some fantastic buffs and some great ways to manage your command points, and of course having the Vanari keyword is really good for him. So I would say he's still solid, he's just very, very pricey now. The generic non-named version of Lyria is next. This is the Vanari Lord Regent. This guy is also a 1-cast wizard and also has 7 health. He's got a 14-inch move and a 3-up save. He is a little bit cheaper at 230 points, but that is still a hefty bump from his 150 points that he was in 3rd. He himself has got 5 attacks with his sword, which hit on 3s. They do only wound on 4s, but they are 1 rend and 2 damage, and they have the crit mortal rule, which is nice. And then again, he's got some token attacks from his mount. He can grant himself once per battle +1 to casting rolls and a -1 to be hit for the turn, so it can make him that little bit better at getting spells off, as well as making him a little bit tankier. But I would say his main use is for buffing your Vanari Dawn Riders. He can, once per battle, give himself and 2 Dawn Rider units in his combat range the ability to reroll charges, and then if they do charge, they also get +1 to their attacks for the turn. So reroll charges and bonus attacks, which is very, very strong on cavalry units, and on the Dawn Riders in particular, as we will see, can make them incredibly scary. In terms of your generic main infantry, they tend to come in the form of either the Sentinels or the Wardens, and the Sentinels are up first. These guys are your archers, and they used to be one of the big boogeymen of 3rd edition. They are still 150 points for 10, so the same as they were in 3rd, but they have changed a little bit. They are, first of all, no longer a wizard unit. The champion doesn't get a spell anymore, and their bows don't have the mortal wound aspect of sun metal weapons anymore. Instead, they just have the crit auto wound ability. However, they do now get 2 attacks rather than 1, so they've actually got a bit better just in the form of sheer volume, but they will now struggle a bit more into those heavily armoured enemies. They still get their lofted shots choice on their war scroll, which gives them a 24-inch range instead of 18 inches, but is at -1 to hit. So they will be 4s and 4s with 1 rend and 1 damage with that profile. Now they are still good, and being Vanari, they can get a lot of bonuses from your battle traits. They can potentially be -1 to be hit and getting crits on 5s for their auto wounds. So they can still do a good bit of work and kind of survive a lot of attacks back whilst putting around 5 unsaved wounds onto a 4-up save unit in a single ranged volley. Up next we have the Banner Blade. This hero is again Vanari, and he's got a solid 5 health with a 3-up save, so he is decently durable. In melee, his sword is 4 attacks that hit on 3s, wound on 4s with 1 rend and 2 damage, and they do mortals on crits, but he is mainly here for his World Banner passive, which gives +3 to the control for all friendly Lumineth units while they are wholly within 18 inches. So this is a massive aura, and it can easily get you a good boost on at least 2, if not 3 objectives, depending on where he is. So it really will help you a lot in taking and keeping hold of those crucial objectives. Now for 130 points, he doesn't do much else, but if you want to win games, he could be a very important part of helping you do that. The Vanari Wardens are next. These are your melee spear-wielding infantry. They've got a slightly better 4-up save compared to the 5-up of the Sentinels, and then instead of shooting, they are just here to hold the line against enemy charges. Their pikes are 2 attacks that hit on 3s, wound on 4s, with no rend and 1 damage, which is decidedly mediocre. But they do have the crit mortal rule, and they also get +1 rend against charging units. On top of that, their rule Wall of Blades means that if this unit didn't charge and an enemy unit did charge them, you can roll a dice, and on a 4+, that enemy unit has strike last. You get to add +1 to this roll if the enemy unit charging you was cavalry, so you can make enemy cavalry strike last on a 3+, and then be throwing 20 attacks, which will be at 1 rend and doing mortals on 6s into them, which is a really good way to deter cavalry and keep your heroes, your ranged units, and your objectives safe behind your main battle lines. So for 140 points, I think these guys are still a solid, reliable backbone to your army. If you want something with a bit more punch though, the Dawn Riders are up next. These are your cavalry units, and with their 14-inch move, 3 health, and a 3-up save, they are actually a lot more like heavy cav than an elf unit might look. They are pricey at 210 points for 5, which is not quite Blood or Chaos Knight level, but it's getting there. But they are exceptionally good, and I would say in some cases, they're actually better than both Blood or Chaos Knights. With only 2 attacks on their lances that hit on 3s and wound on 4s with 1 rend and 1 damage, you might not think so initially, but they are of course +1 damage on the charge, which you would expect. They do also have the crit mortal rule, so they can throw out some mortal damage too, and then on top of that, their Deathly Furrows rule is brilliant. If they charged into infantry, they can roll a dice for each model in your unit, and on a 3+, they do a mortal damage. So a unit of 10 of these, if you buffed them up with, say, the Vanari Lord Regent we saw earlier, and the Power of Hysh Facet of War, could do about 6 or 7 mortal damage from the impact hits from Deathly Furrows, and then with their lances alone, an extra 20 mortal damage or so. So even before we get to the regular non-mortal damage and saves, and also the mount attacks, they could easily kill off an entire 10-man unit of Chaos Warriors, which is an output that not many other units can achieve. It's incredibly strong, and they are just genuinely fantastic at spamming that mortal output into your opponent. So they are an incredibly strong cavalry. I would argue one of the best in the game. Moving on to this Scinari unit, the Cuthala is up next. She is squishy with only a 6-up save and 5 health, and she is, as you would expect, a 1-cast wizard. She's 120 points, and her melee is pretty rubbish. 3 attacks that hit on 3s, wound on 4s with no rend and D3 damage, but she is quite a nice force multiplier for your objective game. She can reduce enemy control by D6 by letting you pick an enemy unit within 12 inches of her in your hero phase, and on a 3+, you subtract that D6 from their score. Now, as we saw in, I think, the Ideneth, D6 is unreliable, so you can't really rely on that being enough to flip an objective for you, but she also gives a nice buff to your control by giving friendly Lumineth units wholly within 12 inches of her the ability to ignore any negative modifiers to their control score. So it does make it a bit easier for you to debuff the enemy and not suffer any detrimental effects yourself, so that you can more easily steal and hold the objective from an opponent. Another favourite of mine from the old High Elves was their Bolt Thrower, and this comes back in spirit in Age of Sigmar in the form of the Star Shard Ballista. It's 5 health and only a 5-up save, but this thing is really just meant to stay still and shoot. It's got a solid 24-inch range and fires 3 shots that hit on 2s, wound on 3s, with 1 rend and d3 damage, and they do have the crit 2 hits and anti-monster +1 rend rule. It also gets 6 inches of extra range with Scryhawks if it's wholly within 12 inches of any Vanari sentinels, so this can be a 30-inch threat range, which is fairly impressive. Now, it's of course not going to wipe out a whole unit by itself, but it can do a seriously good chunk of damage to medium-sized monsters and the like, and it does also have a once per battle ability called Blinding Bolt, and if you fire all of your shooting attacks into the same enemy unit, then that enemy unit gets -1 to their hit rolls for the turn, so it can do a decent amount of damage and also debuff a scary enemy unit quite well too. It has unfortunately gone up to 130 points, so it's not cheap, but if you want some more range in your army and you are going heavy on the Vanari theme anyway, I do think this can be a worthwhile addition to your force. We're back now with a few more Scinari units. The Enlightener is a very pricey 180 points, but a great 2-cast wizard, and actually has some okay damage output. 3 melee attacks that hit on 3s, wound on 4s with 1 rend and 2 damage, and then also 3 ranged attacks that hit and wound on 3s with 1 rend and d3 damage isn't awful as far as combat goes. He does also have his own spell that picks a friendly infantry unit wholly within 18 inches, and on a 6+, he can essentially give them ethereal, making them ignore positive and negative modifiers to their saves until the next turn, which is very nice on things like your 4-up save wardens. On top of that, he can also once per turn, as a reaction when you cast one of your lore spells, roll a dice, and on a 3+, after the spell is resolved, immediately cast it a second time. And this specifically doesn't count as his second cast, and being able to spread those buffs or debuffs around can be really helpful in setting up some favourable combats for you in the following fight phase. The Caligrave is the same profile and also same melee profile as the Enlightener, so he's not terrible in combat himself, and also significantly cheaper at only 120 points. They are only a 1-cast wizard though, and they have no War Scroll spell. Instead, their rule is Realm Scribe, which is once per turn. When you use a summon spell with this unit, he can turn the casting roll into an 8 that can't be modified. So if you fail a spell cast, he can just say, nope, actually that was an 8. So you do get it off, and also make it that little bit trickier for your opponent to unbind. So he's not great in sort of a generic list, but if you are going heavy on summons and manifestations, he is a good way to add some reliability from that aspect to your army. We also have the Scinari Loreseeker, and I'm pretty sure the inspiration for this guy was the old Lore Master of Hoeth, which is a model and unit I absolutely loved in Fantasy. Now he is a pricey 170 points, but is rather good in melee for a wizard. He's got 5 attacks that hit on 3s, wound on 4s, with 1 rend, 2 damage, and the crit mortals rule, so he is quite punchy. He also has 5 health and a 4-up save, and if he is out by himself on his lonesome, he gets +5 to his control score, so he very much likes being a solo traveller, just going around and flipping objectives by himself and his possible 7 control. This does only work if he is more than 9 inches away from all friendly units, but that isn't too difficult to set up, because in the deployment phase, he can, with his rule Independent Operative, be set up anywhere on the battlefield, just not in combat with enemy units. So he doesn't even have to be over 9 inches away, he can just be anywhere on the battlefield outside of combat, which is insane. He's really good for just sort of like putting an immediate threat in your enemy's face. The issue is that it states if an enemy unit deploys after him, they can set up that unit in combat with him. So you can't use him to tie up some chaff when your opponent doesn't expect it in the deployment phase, but they can absolutely put one of their units in combat with him to try and take him out straight away if you do deploy him in the enemy deployment zone. So he's an interesting hero. He can be fantastic at flipping an objective from the very start of the game, but also his freedom in deployment can be really good, but also can be a bit risky, and you really do want to be deploying this guy last in your entire army, and hopefully last in the entire deployment between you and your opponent, so you can put him exactly where you want him and not worry about your opponent putting something into combat with him. Next up, we have another one of my all-time favourites from Fantasy, the Vanari Bladelords, which are the spiritual remasters of the Sword Masters of Hoeth. They are another Vanari unit that are just brutal in combat. They've got 2 health and a 4-up save, so they are fairly tanky for elves, but they do pay for it. They are 140 points for 5, so 28 points per model, which certainly isn't cheap. However, they are very useful. They get a choice of attacks that either hit on 3s and wound on 4s with 1 rend and 1 damage and do mortals on crits, and are also 2 rend against infantry, or you can instead go for a perfect strike, which instead lets you just roll a dice for each model, and on a 2+ they do mortal damage. So a squad of 5 of these can potentially just do a flat 5 mortal damage if they all rolled that 2+, or they can do up to 15 attacks, which could on average net you, around 6 or 7 damage into a 4-up save infantry. So they can cut through chaff reasonably well, and obviously into scarier things with a 3 or even 2-up save like a Skull Crusher, the mortal damage choice might be a better way to blend through them. On top of that, they also act as a bodyguard unit. They give a Scinari hero that is in combat range with them a 5-up ward, and they also get that ward themselves, so they can be decent blenders and also rather durable bodyguards with 2 health and a 4-up save and 5-up ward to protect them and their charge. Elania and Elthor are our next war scroll. The twins have got 8 health between them, and they are a reasonable defensive profile with a 4-up save and a 5-up ward. They are also a 1-cast wizard, but like other heroes, they have had an immense increase, going from 190 points to 280. They do get both of the Scinari and the Vanari keywords, which is very nice, and are likewise a good mix of melee and magical prowess. In combat, they have Altari and Diana, which I think that's how you pronounce it anyway. Altari and Diana, maybe? Anyway, which gives them 5 attacks that hit on 2s, wound on 3s with 1 rend and 2 damage, and then also 2 extra attacks that hit on 3s, wound on 4s with 1 rend and d3 damage. They do also get some solid shooting with 3 attacks on 2s and 3s with 2 rend, d3 damage that also auto wound on crits. And then in your hero phase, you can decide which of the twins will take the lead thanks to equal prodigies. And what this does is it gives you a buff depending on who you pick. Now, Elania grants the unit +1 power level, so an extra spell attempt, and also a 4-up ward save, whilst Elthor, he instead gets you +1 damage on Altari, so if you are casting and in the backfield, Elania might be worth going for, whilst when you are stuck in combat, that damage 3 from Elthor will be incredibly useful. They can also use sudden translocation, which lets them at the end of any turn, if they've killed any enemy models in that turn, heal d6 and then teleport off the battlefield and be set up again 9 inches away from enemies. So it's a great way to get out of danger or get onto an objective you want. If you do this though, Elania has to take the lead in your next turn of equal prodigies. And then finally, they also have a spell which is cast on an 8+, so it's not easy, but the spell is Total Eclipse, and it's a very, very strong spell. If it goes off, then any time an enemy unit uses a command within 18 inches of them, it costs them an extra command point to do so. So it massively, massively impacts their capacity to even use commands, depending on how many points they have, but also really helps to strip them of those valuable command points much more quickly. So it is a very, very strong spell, and I think the unit as a whole has got some really good rules and is really good. It is just incredibly pricey at nearly 300 points. Onto the rock themed units now. The Alarith Stone Mage is another 1-cast wizard, and 150 points comes with 5 health and a 4-up save, and also some mediocre attacks that hit on 3s, wound on 4s, with 1 rend and d3 damage. The Stone Mage has the Living Fissure spell, which is cast on a 7 and lets you draw a straight line between him and a point 18 inches away from him, and you roll a d3 for each unit, both friendly and enemy, that the line passes across, and on a 2+ you do that much mortal damage. So this can hurt your guys too, but if you line it up on a big long section of the enemy battlefront, this can easily hit a good 3 or 4 enemy units and do some reasonably good damage to them. He can also choose to do the Stone Mage stance in the combat phase, which lets him pick an Alarith unit wholly within 12 inches of him, and you roll a dice, and on a 3+, you get to add +1 rend to their attacks for the turn, and this can be really good on something like the Alarith Stone Guard, who are pricey like the Bladelords. It's 130 points for 5, but again, with that 2 health and 4-up save, they are reasonably tanky. They likewise get a 5-up ward save, but theirs is when they are contesting an objective, so they are very good at just sitting in the midfield and keeping hold of those key important areas for you. And then their hammers are very strong too. They've got 2 attacks each that hit and wound on 3s with 1 rend and 2 damage. So with that buff from the Stone Mage, they can be 2 rend, which gets them to a very solid profile, and they really can do quite a lot of work into enemy infantry as well as enemy monsters. Plus, the other good thing about them is that they look awesome too. The Giant Cows are also Alarith units, with Avalanor being the named version. He is 16 health and has a brilliant 3-up save and 6-up ward. Now he is 410 points, which is quite a lot, but he is just fantastic in combat. He's got d6 damage at range with his Geomantic Blast, so he can do some damage before he charges in, but then his Fire Stealer Hammers are 6 attacks that hit on 3s, wound on 2s with 2 rend and 4 damage. So even into something like a 3-up save Chaos Warrior, he could be doing over 8 damage to them, killing off around 4 of them in a single go. And then he's got a couple of extra attacks from his hooves that do 2 damage, so just doing a little bit extra to finish anything off that may still be alive after his hammers. Now his hammer attacks do drop to 4 attacks when he's injured, but he can actually ignore that if he's near to a Stone Mage. So that is a great little combo just to keep him going at kind of maximum capacity as much as possible. And then on top of that, he also has 2 combat phase abilities. Unshakable Faith in the Mountains costs a command point, but lets you pick 3 Alarith units wholly within 12 inches of him, and they get +1 to their attacks for the turn, so turning those Stone Guard from earlier into an even more terrifying threat. And then the Unbreakable Bulwark is done in any combat phase once per turn. If he didn't charge, he can pick an enemy unit in combat with him, and you roll a dice, and on a 2+, you subtract 1 from the rend of their melee weapons, and also add +1 attack to his, so making them much worse, and also making Avalanor even more scary. So he is a really big threat, and I would say because of his damage output alone, and the buffs that he can bring to your other Alarith unit, he's probably worth that 410 points. The generic Spirit of the Mountain is a little bit weaker with only 14 health, but he is a lot cheaper at only 330 points. It has also got a decent melee output, only 4 attacks this time, but instead of damage 4, these guys actually have damage 5 on their profile, so they can be very, very scary into big monsters. Again, they can ignore the battle damaged ability when they are within 12 inches of a Stone Mage, which really helps them stay worth their points. And again, they do also have a Rampage, which is Stone Heart Shockwave, and this lets you pick a unit you're in combat with, and if you didn't charge, you can roll a dice, and on a 4+, you give that unit Strike Last for the turn. So it's not super reliable being on a 4+, but Strike Last is, as always, a really strong debuff to bring, and it can make it so that you can be throwing up to 20 damage into an enemy unit before they can swing back into you, which is definitely nice to have. From mountains onto speed and the wind, the Hurakan Wind Mage is next. 150 points for a 5 health, 5-up save, 1-cast wizard with fly and a decent 12-inch move isn't too bad. They do have a reasonably scary ranged attack from their Wind Blast Vortex, so they can do a reliable bit of chip damage thanks to that D3 profile. They are rather met in melee with their Aspiragillum, only hitting on 3s, winning on 4s with 1 rend and 2 damage and only 2 attacks, so it's not going to do much. What they can do is some teleport trickery with Transporting Vortex. Now this is cast on a 7, but lets you pick a friendly Lumineth unit wholly within 12 inches of them and not in combat, and you can pick it up and set it up again 9 inches from enemies. So this is a really nice way to get away from an incoming enemy charge or just move them around onto another objective. And then he can also, in your movement phase, use his Wind Leap ability to pick a Wind Charges unit wholly within 12 inches, and on a 3+, you can add 3 inches to their movement, and they get the fly keyword. So this can really help your Wind Charges. I mean, it could help them get into a charge off, but you don't really want them in combat. So I would say this is really just to help them get around the board a bit more reliably, to get out of range of someone or get into range with their bows, or just get onto an objective. Sevireth, another of the old Lumineth boogeymen, has gone up from 270 points to 350, so a rather hefty increase there. He's also dropped in movement from 24 to 18 inches, so it's still insanely fast, but it has gone down. He's also gained a 4-up save, and he still has his 5-up ward, so he is still rather durable. Now, his melee is nothing to write home about, but Enethrai, his bow, is still very scary. It's got 4 attacks that hit on 2s, wound on 3s with 3 rend and D3 plus 1 damage, which is very good with its 12-inch range. It can easily net you over 5 damage into a 3-up save Chaos Warrior profile. He also can't be targeted by enemy units that are over 9 inches away, so he's quite safe from enemy shooting thanks to the Living Gale. And then he also lets friendly Hurakan units within 12 inches of him shoot and or charge, even if they have a run or retreated that turn, which is incredibly good for getting onto objectives and still shooting the enemy, or even getting up into the enemy lines and potentially charging if you wanted to get an early charge off in the early stages of the game. His final ability is Searing Desert Winds, which is his rampage. It lets him pick 3 enemy units that he's in combat with, and you roll a d3 for each, and on a 2+ you do that much mortal damage to them. They also get -1 to their wound rolls for the turn, so it can do some good chip damage, but also has a really great debuff component to make sure that anything that is in combat with him is going to have a hard time actually hurting him. The Hurakan cavalry, the Wind Chargers, are much more shooty than fighty, but still they are very good light cavalry with 3 health, a 4-up save, and that 14-inch move. They are a cheaper 170 points for 5, and their bows are only a 12-inch range, but with 3 attacks each that hit on 3s, wound on 4s with 1 rend and 1 damage, they are decent anti-chaff units, and they get even better because their Wind Charger arrows means that ward saves can't be made against their attacks, so those 15 shots can actually do a lot more than you might think, and they will be great into anything like death factions or armies that rely on a ward save to keep them safe, because they will be much more vulnerable to that shooting now. They are just generally a great little harassment unit, and they are arguably cheap enough, I would say, so that if you are going heavy on the Hurakan theme, they are a decent little screening unit as well. The generic version of Sevireth, the Spirit of the Wind, has the same 18-inch move, but only has 8 health rather than Sevireth's 10, but still has that 4-up save and 5-up ward, so they are still quite durable. Their bow is almost as good, it's just D3 damage rather than D3 plus 1, but it does get a pip of rend against monsters. They also get to grant shoot and charge even if a Hurakan unit has run or fallen back with the Spirit of the Wind, but their rampage is different. Instead, theirs is Living Cyclone, and this allows you to pick an enemy unit in combat with him and roll a d3, and on a 2+ you do that much mortal damage, but then on top of that, your Spirit of the Wind can move 6 inches. Now, they do have to end that move in combat, but you can potentially move into another combat to tag another enemy unit, or just maybe move away from that one particular scary enemy hero that you don't want to fight. So it's a great way to keep your guy alive, or just close down more of the enemy army. So for 240 points, I actually think he's not that shabby. The final non-spell unit is the Yggdrasil Riverblades. They are 140 points for 10. Now they only have 1 health and a miserable 5-up save, but they are okay against heroes. With their blades, they have 3 attacks each that hit on 3s, wound on 4s, with 2 rend against heroes and 1 damage. So they can do a lot of work just through sheer weight of dice. They can also move 2d6 in any combat phase, but they must again end in combat, but potentially you can use that to again tie up an enemy unit or avoid a particular hero they may not want to face just yet. And then in the movement phase, they also have an ability called Travel the Waterways. This is a very simple, let you remove them from the board and set them up again 9 inches from enemies and 6 inches from the battlefield edge. So they are just a very slippery unit that has some great movement tricks to let you get them right where you need them and go after those weaker enemy heroes, and then you can just drown them in weight of dice. Finally, we have the manifestations, the Hishian Twin Stones, the Rune of Petrification, and the Sanctum of Amintok. The Twin Stones are cast on a 5+ and are set up wholly within 6 inches of the caster, and then they give +1 to casting rolls for Lumineth units that are wholly within 6 inches of them, so a nice way to get even more out of your magic phases. The Rune of Petrification has a harder cast value of 7+, but this is set up wholly within 18 inches of the caster, so quite a big radius, and then you can pick each enemy unit within 6 inches of it to be its target, and you roll a d3 for each of them, and on 2+ you do that much mortal damage, and if you do 3 mortal damage to a unit with its attack, they also get strike last for the turn. So it's a great way to do a load of chip damage to a castled up enemy army and also potentially debuff their subsequent fight phase too, so that you can hit them before they hit you back. The Sanctum of Amintok is cast on a very easy 4+, and you pick a friendly Lumineth infantry hero wholly within 12 inches of the caster and 3 inches away from all other units and terrain features, and you set this manifestation up in combat range of the hero, in a ring around the hero, because it comes in 3 parts, in a ring around your hero, and then while the hero is inside that ring, they get a 4-up ward save, they get +1 to their power level if they're a wizard, and they also can't move. If they do, the manifestation is removed from play. So you can just use this to further buff your spellcasting and make a particular hero or wizard even more durable thanks to that 4-up ward. Last but not least, there is a piece of faction terrain as well. The Shrine Luminor has a 3-up save and 12 health, and it lets you pick a hero to become the Shrine Guardian. And what this does is it lets you re-roll a casting roll for them once per turn thanks to cleansing rituals, but it also lets the shrine move around with a 6-inch move, as long as the Guardian remains like inside the shrine, and he basically fights as though the shrine is him, so you measure from the shrine rather than the hero. Now, if the shrine gets destroyed, the Guardian does take d3 mortal damage, but it is a nice way to get some more reliability from their casting and also spread any of their like auras and buffs that little bit more because you measure from the shrine. All in all, the Realmlords have got a lot going for them. They do have some very expensive heroes, and in general they are an elite low model count army, but their buffs and spells are incredibly strong, and they really do have a lot of ways to boost their casting values or proc off a load of mortal damage in quite large auras a lot of the time. So I really like them, and I think whether you are going for a combined arms list or focusing on one particular aspect like the Scinari or the Alarith or the Vanari, you can really do that and leverage those battle traits to get the most out of whichever units you want to bring. But as always, what do you make of the Lumineth, and which facets of war do you think are the best? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me, but until next time, I'll catch you later guys.